pull anybody in. They have to connect their grades.
There's me, and occasionally we do have a little technical problem because we sort of lose it. But I'm still looking for. I see Wendy's here twice, but we also need Eddie Webster. Is Eddie in the house, or we should just get going since we're quite late already?
We've just been told that he had a family emergency and therefore will not be able to join us.
Oh my, okay. Well, Prof. Madansala, my name is Patrick Bond, and you're also seeing online, I hope, Ndangwa and Eric and Wendy. So would you mind terribly if we were on first name basis? We all have to be as relaxed and comfortable. Would that be fine with you then? May I call you Tuli?
No, it won't be fine. If you're not going to call me Prof, you're going to call me Miss Madansala.
Okay, I take that. That's irony. I've also spent time in the United States. I know what that means. Irony. Yeah. Would it be fine to get us underway? Shall I begin, or would you like to say hello to the masses for us from our distant locations? We also don't have video of your side yet.
You're the facilitator. Just go ahead.
I will go ahead. I would beg you for video on that side. So DPK, if Chanel can just turn on whatever it is for the camera, that will be very helpful. Right, let us get underway. I'm Patrick Bond. I understand that our guru of the topic of restitution, economic justice, wealth, income, Eddie Webster isn't joining us, but that gives me just a couple of minutes extra to list, which I think we're all sort of meant to do, the sort of restitutions that we think about. And I, as a white male with a nationality from various places, global north especially, and sitting in Johannesburg, the most unequal city in the world, I'd love to quickly list 15 things I feel deserve a very hot debate on restitution, many of which are actually underway in the spheres of wealth and income. The wealth, number one, from the white male settler colonial land theft, and secondly, from slavery and colonial appropriation. So now we're back in the 15, 16, 1700s, but the systems put in place would be, I would call them, thirdly, super exploitative, insofar as long-distance migrant labor has lowered the reproduction costs of the worker, meaning those who consume worker products also have restitution based on that degree of injustice. A fourth would be the longer-term exploitation of black workers, even outside migrancy, through racist systems and the banning of trade unions for so long. It's 50 years next year since the Durban workers got us up and running with a new breath of momentum for trade unionism, and it's been fading, and we need to think about whether trade unions, when they say surplus value extraction, that they need stronger restitution. If they're only being offered 3.5% by the public service when inflation is 7.5%, that'll add to that restitution. May I continue? A fifth would be the local ecological degradation. So we have an unequal ecological exchange, sixth, and that's partly the local pollution processes of our air and land and water, our bodies, but it's also the south to north flows, which seventh brings me to how this country got rich, half the world's gold at one point underneath where I am in Johannesburg, but then it evaporated. And that's what we would say is the non-renewable mineral extraction. Again, wealth depletion. And a form of restitution there is the questioning of whether we have fair trade in commodities, as opposed to speculation and power relations through multinationals. Now, number 8, the outsized contribution, because of our minerals energy complex, from this country, from people like me, to the climate catastrophe. We actually rank 3rd in the world, after Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic, in the output, the emissions output per unit of GDP per person. So it's an extremely carbon-intensive economy that we're all grappling with. And what kind of climate debt do we owe, especially 500 people in KwaZulu-Natal who died in one day, April 11 this year, from the rain bombs that hit. That's just one example, and there are plenty of others of the climate catastrophe hitting here and our neighbors. A ninth one is the apartheid era profiteering. So as we come closer to the present and we find something like the Supreme Court judgment using Alien Tort Claims Act to sort of dismiss the Jubilee and the Kulumani case against GM and 19 other multinational corporates, it's always time to revisit that sort of apartheid era profiteering and the demand for restitution. And then we come to the current version of that, the corruption crisis. We know our state has some problems. We certainly
program. It's just technology. The original plan was not possible. Suppose they couldn't assign. We've lost the facilitator. Tabi saying you're an economist. Can you facilitate? Because I'm just worried that we're going to. And Tabi Sen wrote a paper together with Mark Swelling on an alternative approach to the economy. So this restitution came from last year's conference, which was focusing on the economy. So the idea was, without restitution, you can't even begin to talk about voting, because you're voting with other people being so far behind. So we wanted here to then clarify on all of these themes. In what way are people behind in a manner that is related to the laws of the past that we adjust? And then so that we can then say, well, how are we going to address restitution as part of building our society anew, particularly regarding economic justice and social psychological justice.
Thanks, Rob. Rob has put me on the spot. I'm not sure. Have all the speakers spoken?
No, nobody has spoken.
Oh,
our
right.
chair, our facilitator
to.
was just framing it for us. Unfortunately, technology was unkind.
All right, thanks, Prof.
When he comes back,
I'll escape. Yes. So just to assist the process, is Prof. Let me just check the next.
Eddie Webster is not here.
And Dr. Heppel is here. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think he's next, and followed by Wendy. So let's allow Dr. Eric Heppel to come in and share his area of minimum wage as a restitutive measure. Thanks. Over to you, Dr. Heppel.
Sorry, guys. Prof, I think Prof. Mngangwa wants to be first. He's got some obligations that he has to attend to.
Okay,
so if it's okay with you guys.
Yes, over to you, Prof. Mngangwa.
I'm very sorry that this has come up, but I've got class at 4 o'clock, so I just gotta rush through my presentation. I don't know if that will be fine.
100% sure. Did everybody hear my discussion? I hope so, because it just gave me a little blue light saying I needed to share. So in our discussion, we're very fortunate that the program now will start with Professor Thuli Madonsela. Thuli's going to give us the thematic paper on rescuing social justice promises from these centuries of unjust economic laws and practices. I'm going to then jump to Ndangwa Noyu from UCT, because he has a 4 p.m. call at his university in Munich, where he's guest lecturing. And then we'd have Eric and Wendy. Eric Keppel, who's working on his MBA and is a lawyer and addressing the minimum wage, and Wendy Dobson on responsible corporate practices in politics. Prof. Tuli Madonsela, may I turn it over to you, please?
Prof, we were told that Professor Ndangwa was going to start.
And we still do need from DPK a camera. We need a video link. Would that be possible?
You can't see me.
She's over here. Yes, Prof. Madonsela. Oh, they can't see?
You can't see?
Can none of you guys see?
Is Chanel, are you there from DPK Productions? Are you able to go ahead and link us in?
Okay, so everyone else can see. It's just on Patrick's side. It might be because of his internet.
Well, I'm hearing nothing from DPK Productions, so I'm just going to very quickly try to call to see if there's some technical glitch and whether all this high tech.
Can anybody else hear and see us?
Just forgive me for 1 second to see if we can tap in there. Or does anybody else have an idea to be able to reach us?
Just communicate with him.
We can see you. They can see us except you, Prof. Bond.
Hello, it's Patrick at the Wealth Income and Economic Justice session. Is the link broken? We're not hearing anything, and it's just a blank screen. No, it's Wealth, Income and Economic Justice, #1 session.
Eric, are you able just to communicate with
Okay, great.
on that you can
We're
hear
just
us?
seeing, we're hearing nothing and seeing nothing. So thanks if you can. Sure.
Okay, we'll do.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Prof. Bond, we are able to see the DPK and hear them. So I think the problem is just on your side, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, if you think, Eric, that this is my problem, are you listening?
It is, Prof.
To Tuli, let me just type this.
Can you hear me, Dr. Eric?
Yes, I can. Prof.
So it means it's only Patrick who can't hear.
He's typing in our chat. It's definitely on his side because everyone else can hear us. It's not on our side, Dirty.
Right. I don't know. If you guys just tell him that you are going to speak, Dr. Ndangwa, because
Right. Thank you. Patrick,
we have very limited time.
hi, Patrick. Can you hear me? Patrick? Yeah, can you hear me? I don't think you can hear me. Right, so I'm going to start as Professor Madonsela has pointed out. And I don't know if you can, I'm trying to share the screen. If you can see my screen, a PowerPoint.
Not yet.
You can't see it.
Not yet. Perhaps it takes just a while. Let's just see.
As I'm sharing. All right. I'm just going to go old school. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ndangwa Noyo, and based at the University of Cape Town in the Department of Social Development. And I'm going to present on the notion of social reengineering in South Africa for a post-apartheid social justice. And I'm moving from the premise that South Africa is one of the most socially engineered societies in the world. For 350 years, we've found that South Africa has been engineered in a particular way. Well, was engineered in a particular way. Access to wealth creation was engineered in a particular way through the nation's political system that was underpinned by race supremacy. So that is the basis of my presentation. And my notion is that in order to have a just society, right, as well as restitution, we need to take the society and reconstruct it all together. And it needs to be re-engineered in a particular way through transformative social policies and through transformative public policies. Because most of the policies that were inherited from the past and reformed and were developed post-1994, they didn't have an deliberate mechanism to re-engineer what was inherited colonialism and apartheid. And therefore, there's a need to re-engineer what was bequeathed South Africa post-1994. And I go back to the premise of what former President Thabo Mbeki presented to the nation in 1996 when he was a deputy president, where he mentioned
Prof. Ngwama, sorry, the sound is breaking up at the moment. I'm so sorry for interrupting you. It's intermittent. We're hearing you not clearly.
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It seems to be breaking up, Prof. I'm sorry for disturbing you.
No. Thank you for that, because I don't know what's happening with our technology. But so I'll go back to the premise of former President Thabo Mbeki, his notion of a two-nation state. That indeed South Africa is a country of two nations. And part of their understanding is that those two nations were created by a very well orchestrated, well planned process of social engineering. And so, when we talk about the unequal society, I'm not going to read his in full, but I want to link to the Human Development Index of 1994, which was disaggregated by the United Nations Human Development Program. They were able to make a very clear case by showing that indeed South Africa is a two-nation state. And so after they disaggregated the data, they were able to show that the Human Development Index for privileged white South Africa was perhaps hovering around the region of Spain, right? And then when they disaggregated the Human Development Index, they were able to show that Black South Africa was hovering in the neighborhood of Congo. So already the notion of a two-nation state that was advanced by Thabo Mbeki was actually, we got the evidence through the Human Development Index of 1994, when it was disaggregated. And so it shows us that indeed President Mbeki was not hallucinating, but he was actually referring to the fact that we have got two nations side by side in South Africa, where opportunities accrue to a particular group of people due to the fact that the country was socially engineered in a particular way. So that's the basis of my presentation. And I just want to rush because I don't want to take time. But the key issue that I want to bring to the fore from that presentation is the notion of an equal opportunities. More often than not in South Africa, when we talk about issues of inequalities, etc., we do not talk about inequality of opportunity. And for me, that's the starting point when we begin to talk about re-engineering a society such as South Africa, which is heavily engineered through colonialism, deliberate policies and legislation that created particular opportunities for certain people. And therefore, we find that due to that pernicious, well-planned agenda, colonial vestiges of exclusion keep on reinforcing themselves automatically, in spite of the government's interventions, because the interventions are not seeking to re-engineer the society altogether. So it's almost piecemeal type of interventions. Yes, we have social security of 18 million people in the social assistance program, and yet we cannot liberate them from that program to other programs. And therefore, for me, the notion of social re-engineering has to talk about inequality of opportunity. So when we talk about inequality of opportunity, we're talking about where you're born, where you're actually located, the types of schools you go to will predetermine where you're going to end up 20 years from now. As a child, as a teenager, and as a young adult.
And breaking up again very badly. Do you want to see if there's one last task to reconnect us? And my apologies, for some reason, I don't know, I fell off the line for a while, but Ndango, go ahead. That looks
Can you hear me?
very bad breaking up. Yeah, we're only getting every other word.
Oh my gosh.
It may be that we beg you to send your paper and we can mull it over.
Yeah.
And I also understand you have to leave at 4, but while I was away, presumably we decided that Prof. Madansela would grant you the first speaking.
Yeah.
Should we switch to her and then you can still work on it and maybe give us a wrap up after she's finished?
All right.
Okay. Apologies from our world of the ether that it's a bit hazy. Thuli, would you like to then move forward with the main speech?
Thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you to the facilitator and to Prof. Ndangwa. I basically agree with everything you've said, and therefore my approach will resonate with you. Based on the formula that we gave to everyone, I'm going to follow that formula, even though I have a written paper. So the starting point is, what is my understanding of restitution? And the Oxford Dictionary defines restitution as the restoration of something that has been lost or stolen from the proper owner, or compensation for injury or loss. And we've heard in the room the etymology of the concept. It comes from an Italian word, restitutio, and then it was popularized by the French. The most important thing, though, that is important for the world, not just for South Africa, whether we're talking slavery or we're talking South Africa, is that restitution is not the same as compensation or even welfare. In restitution, it's based on, the emphasis on restitution is the person who got something wrongfully. In other words, if you gain something wrongfully, you have to give it up. So it's a gains-based theory. Restitution is a gains-based theory, as opposed to compensation, which is a loss base. You know, if I got my leg chopped and then somebody will compensate me for it. So originally, as we were told earlier, restitution was if you got something, it's almost like unjustified enrichment. You got something that did not belong to you. In other ways, you gained something that you shouldn't have, and then you've got to give it back. Why I highlight that is that when we talk restitution in South Africa in particular, even on socioeconomic rights, which I was part of shaping the socioeconomic rights from the BRICS group, and we were concerned that socioeconomic rights should be a balancing act. And then flip, you come, socioeconomic rights have been used to extract things from government instead of to reshape power relations in society. So that's just why I want you to be aware of that definition of restitution. And then to say that why restitution is the next part of it. Okay, thank you. Oh, that looks marvelous now. Why restitution? Firstly, it is a legal requirement in South Africa. We have case law. I've cited cases here similar to the ones that the minister used. It's Batu Star versus Batu Star Fishing Company versus Minister of Environmental Affairs, where the Judge Standling Noble said, in this fundamental way, our constitution differs from other constitutions, which assume that all are equal, and in so doing simply entrench existing inequalities. Our constitution recognizes that decades of systematic racial discrimination entrenched by the apartheid legal order cannot be eliminated without positive action being taken to achieve that result. We are required to do more than that. The effects of discrimination may continue indefinitely unless there is a commitment to end it. And Moseneke says this in Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden. Of course, democratic values and fundamental human rights espoused by our Constitution are fundamental, but just as crucial is the commitment to strive for a society based on social justice. In this way, our Constitution heralds not only equal protection of the law and non-discrimination, but also the start of a credible and abiding process of reparation for past exclusion, dispossession, and indignity within the discipline of our constitutional framework. And you will find this repeated in cases such as AfriForum versus City of Tshwane by Mokoeng. And then in Daniels versus Privante, Edwin Cameron speaks about the past is not gone. It won't leave us until we respond to its call for justice. So at a practical level, globally, I've given statistics here on ownership of property, because the tendency is just to look at unemployment figures, and that doesn't really help us. We have to look at the economy in its entirety. So I've got global statistics there that are quite shocking. But let me start with South African statistics. We all know that upper bound level poverty is at 55.5%. But how many of you know what it looks like when it's disaggregated by race? Among white people, it's at 1%. Among those classified as Indian or Asian, it's at 6%. Among those classified as colored, it is at 38 to 40%. And among those classified as African by law, it is at 64.2%. That's just the question of poverty. You look at wealth distribution, you look at income distribution, the pattern is similar. So what are the implications of this question for restitution is that this did not come accidentally. It was designed, and Prof. Sampie Blanche has written a book, Inequality, 1652 to 2002, where he talks about how South African laws were driven by the needs of British capital, foreign capital. So it would be it started with the sugarcane farmers. They would go to government, pass this law, because in the 18th century, slavery was banned. And with slavery banned, they still needed very cheap labor, sort of slave level labor for the maize farming in South Africa. And then they started them initially with your master-servant law, poll tax, laws that reduced the number of cows that you could have, the amount of land you could have if you're African. What was the significance of that? Two ways was that then you would have enough land that doesn't allow you subsistence farming and enough cows that don't allow you to be independent. Humans were independent at that stage. But thirdly, if your cows, whatever reason, exceeded the number, or we found out of your assigned area, your cows were taken away through the laws that were still there when I was public protector. Shockingly, the impounding laws, where they don't take, if say your cow was on someone else's farm, normally it would be a fine, normal commerce. Here they would take your entire property. And of course, then people's livestock was decimated. And Professor Sampie Blanche then said, what capital in South Africa, this railroading of capitalism in an economy at that stage that was communitarian, basically. There was never feudalist. I've seen books written where people just don't understand the meaning of feudalism. And if you read Marx, you read Engels, the origin of the family, private property, you will find out that feudalism is where you have serfdom. So you didn't have, everyone had possession, the rights to their own plot, and the chief didn't own anything. The chief was the overseer of the staff. But at the end of the day, then people were forced to go and work in the maize farms. And then when that was not enough, when gold, the diamond was discovered in Kimberley and gold was discovered in Transvaal, capital again needed more labor. And new laws were passed, and you get the 1913 Land Act among the additional set of laws. But there's a litany of laws. We've prepared a whole set of laws for you on how South Africa was designed for extraction from women and the local community, for stratification of humanity, but also for extraction from South Africa to England. And again, you get that not just from Professor Sampie Blanche, you get that message from Helene Opperman Lewis. She's an Afrikaner woman who's written a book that is called Apartheid Britain's Bastard Child. There's another thing that is said there. Okay, let me just finish the economy then. But there was still a poor white problem that came from the First World War and the economic downturn after the First World War, plague, etc. So by 1932, there was a problem. Carnegie Commission was created, and the Carnegie Commission was created. At that stage, the English were very concerned about revolt, potential revolt. You remember, this is also after the Treaty of Versailles, where they've already seen what injustice does, that it creates conflict, it creates conditions that are necessary, that are ripe for war, and it encourages people to go with fascists, and they'd seen what had happened in Italy, etc. So they were worried about the Afrikaners, and what then happens in 1932, the poor white problem, at that stage, blacks were more poor. The statistics are there from Sampie Blanche. There were more Black poverty was higher than white poverty in the number of Black people that we poor, we more. But the Carnegie report said they should only resolve white poverty. The part that is really scary, and I think the Carnegie Commission should also bear accountability, because they said in solving white poverty, the poorest white person should be richer than the richest Black person. Hence, you get 1% poverty among white people. In that 55%, it's hiding reality, because you're just thinking. So when Prof. Ndangwa talks about two nations, those two nations did not emerge accidentally. And you can see a difference between the generation of Pete Dikase, Charlotte Maxege. Those were people that could work for themselves, started their own companies, and stories like that. Then, from 1932, people always say whites did it for themselves. Here, I will say to you, we play a game that is called a read monopoly game, where you kick out one team, you let the other one play, you give them advantages. Of course, within that team, you're going to have shades of that team. There will be those who work harder, there will be those who are smarter, and of course, there will be differences within that team. So even John Rawls, when he talks about fairness to all, he does acknowledge that some people, of course, will do better than others, and some will, but it doesn't mean that there is a whole group. The jobs were created in the railway sector, scholarships were created. You must also read the book by Justice Edwin Cameron, Justice, where he talks about how he himself benefited from those opportunities that were only given to white people. And then that was not enough. 1948, still National Party comes into power, and it decides that on top of that, it's going to introduce the group area state. So we already have most of the land gone, and the Africans only have 13% of the land after the 1913 Land Act. It was augmented by other acts to 1913 took far more land, but after a little while, there was a little bit more land given. 1948 brings in more laws that don't allow Africans to own land, but this is then we get what we heard from Lamis de Klerk. The law that was passed in 1952, racial classification, arbitrary, no DNA. Interestingly, Wilcox is supposed to have been a nasty fellow, but in that case, he did say it was a stupid idea to do racial classification among coloreds and whites, because already, if you read Helene Opperman Lewis, already the whites that were in the country were already mixed blood, primarily mixing with the Khoi and San. So he said there would be 10,000 borderline cases. In the end, there were 90,000 borderline cases. And I don't know what they did with those people, but what we learned from there is that the devastation now is not just people who had their land taken away. Business rights, but the story that's not emerging, which I've discussed with Helen Zille, is you were competing with everyone across, with 100% people. So 90% of the people you're competing with are kicked out of the game. And obviously you're gonna do better, even before we talk about the free loans that we've given, the free land that is given, but just your competition has been kicked out, that's number one. But secondly, that competition becomes your consumers, because having no shops of their own, they have to get into taxis and come and buy into town. So, to cut the long story, the unequal wealth in South Africa, the unequal opportunities are part of manufactured inequality. So why should we remedy this? Because the Constitution says so, but also because statistics from economists show that economies that have a lower Gini coefficient, that have invested in the majority of their people, do better. They're not only resilient, they are less vulnerable. So there's a difference between a resilient economy and a less vulnerable economy. During COVID-19, for example, resilient economies bounce back fast, like America. but less vulnerable economies were not flawed to start with. They didn't have to bounce back, or they had very little bouncing back. So if you invest in most of your people, you are going to do better. So what has South Africa done post-democracy? Mandela, who gets blamed around the economy, is blamed for nothing. Mandela was very clear that the constitution was not going to be a magical wand, as the minister said, and he was the one personally pushing us to write the Equality Act. And the Equality Act has both anti-discrimination and restitutive measures. Chapter 5 was supposed to give government departments an opportunity to do an audit of what's happening in terms of enduring inequalities because of the designed inequality of the past, and then voluntary come up with measures. So it wasn't even as cohesive as BE. It was you do it voluntarily and then you fix it. And this is the kind of thing that Stellenbosch University has done despite government. And yeah, I'm not, of course, trying to make Stellenbosch look good. There's still difficulties, as Jonathan has said. But the idea was find out in what way are we still unequal, and then begin a process of disrupting that inequality. And it's not just the economy, also goes with dignity, because if you read the book Verwoerd by Wilhelm Verwoerd, once they decided to kick the blacks out of the system, they had to tell stories about why the blacks do not deserve. And because you're still going to be a good person and you want people to think you don't do irrational things. And Ellen Opperman Lewis talks about debasement. And that debasement endures today. I'm going to give you just one final story about that and how it impacts on the economy, because humans generally want to be safe and nobody wants to work with somebody who is a threat. So number one, you've been kicked out of the economy. The education system has been dumped down. That's the new laws that were passed by the National Party. And even openly saying that they don't want blacks competing with whites. The interesting thing is that Verwoerd never said blacks were dumb. He dumped them down. He never said they were dumb. He created an education system to dump them down and to make them dependent on whites. But Helene Opperman Lewis says the first eyewitness accounts by John Barrow, I think, from England, when he came here, because the Afrikaners that were here were poor ones and farmers and just generally simple people, he had more glowing statements, and this is written in his travels, more glowing statements about the Xhosas than he did about the Afrikaners. So clearly, all of these stories about them being dangerous, about them being this, that, and that, was manufactured to justify exclusion. And when my son was doing his education, this is a final story, at Glenstacia Primary, part of his writing, of what he had to do, was a booklet with history of South Africa. And there was a paragraph there that was saying when the people left the Cape and went into the inland, they were faced with many dangers. Snakes, wild animals, and natives. I went to Glenstacia Primary to ask Mr. Pretorius, in this picture, where does my son fit in and how should he see his place here? Mr. Pretorius said, well, we don't write these books, it's the school governing body that determines what we write. But I then asked myself, how many people who make choices about employment, who make choices about your suppliers, who make choices about who's safe, who's reliable, learned that. And another book that you can read that also shows you the mental now, the social, psychological impact of the basement would be one by, oh God, this guy is a priest. But let me end it there and say, I see the economy being central to why we remain equal. And it's not about jobs, because jobs is what Verwoerd wanted the Africans to have. He didn't want them to own anything. He didn't want them to be independent. He wanted them to be dependent on white. And the 1932 Carnegie Report never thought that you could fix education without fixing social life. It had themes on things that needed to be fixed to fix white poverty. So post-democracy, there hasn't been that systematic approach that says, here's the scheme holistically that we're going to use. That's why this conference has tried then to look at the scheme to say, let's look at the economy in terms of wealth, income and economic justice, health, well-being, family and social life. These things are sort of copied from Professor Sampito Blanchi's book, Land, Housing and Spatial Equality, Media Digitalization, Innovation, Education and Epistemology, and Public Governance, Democratic Leadership and Access to Justice. These things still had an impact on the economy. For example, who do we see as innovator and as the kind of person we could employ in the right spaces is determined by how we see the past. And Wendy Luhade writes about this in Defining Moments. It is in the paper about how all of these early tapes have influenced how industry practices. I speak to industry a lot, and it's quite fascinating what we call the Oreo effect in our diversity management language. When they put a black person, they put a black person at the top, then you have a thick white cream, and then you have an army of black people at the bottom. So even in employment, those patterns of the past remain. So my proposal is threefold. One is we need to embrace the social justice vision in the Constitution, and our leaders and ourselves really talk about it. And for this, I thank Stellenbosch University because I think they pioneered the whole approach of making social justice the central focus of our societal vision. The second thing that I propose is to have an archive where we put together all of these laws and we look at them collectively and hopefully work with algorithms to look at what would the future have looked like if these laws that designed the extractive and hierarchical South Africa had not existed. And then the third part, what I'm proposing is social compacting. I honestly do not think that we should expropriate without compensation. I honestly do not think that we could force change. I know the limits of the law, that people don't always change because of the law, but I do think that I speak to people, I've spoken to farmers, and I've found that when people understand what happened, why are we unequal because of what happened, they are better receptive to the idea of doing something to discharge the burden of privilege that has been bestowed on them. On my side, I do consider myself privileged too, because I was politically connected because of my history, which I'm not going to tell you fully now because I'm running out of time. But what I do in my special time, I have paid without claiming tax for my my sister's children, and two of them now, one of them is sort of an engineer, one of them is doing his master's, the last few months of the master's, providing him with everything because he wouldn't fit in. They are in the missing middle. And I do action for inclusion. I climb for pets instead of asking government to pay for them because I think government should pay for other things. But more importantly, together with the University of Stellenbosch, they created this chair without me. And I was lucky to be invited to be the one to work with them in making it make an impact. And we are suggesting that we should have this NUSA plan for social justice. And it primarily focuses on law reform, impact-conscious law reform. And I spoke about it earlier, if any of you were in the room, about, I think partly why I'm equal, because the laws have not looked at what would be the impact. Instead, they created inroads, what I call in-realms, where the laws are coming from the side. Okay, let's have affirmative action, let's have this, but they're not looking at the laws that we pass every day. What's the impact on inequality? And we think COVID was a gift in this regard because we showed through COVID that if you go one size fits all, if you don't bend the future to make sure that nobody falls through the cracks, they are going to fall through the cracks and inequality is going to be exacerbated. So that's some of the things that we're doing, and we invite you to join us in doing those things. Thank you.
It's a fantastic paper, and I can't wait for it to be circulated. We can all learn from it. Because in Ndangwa, Nuyo had to teach right now in Munich, and they're very strict there in Germany. We're going to move to Eric Heppel. Would you like to take off, Eric? And if you have slides to share, I assume you find where that screen share is below.
Patrick, can you just assist? Can you hear me? All right, can you hear me?
Yes, your voice is okay. Maybe just speak loudly.
Okay. And can you just can you see what I'm sharing at the moment?
Yes, now we can, and yes, perfect. That's wonderful.
Great. Okay, that's good. My volume all right?
Yes, Alfred.
Thank you. Hello, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm Eric Heppel, and it's daunting to speak after someone with the statue of Professor Thuli Madonsela. So it's an honor for me to be here and to address you. And I hope I've found the speakers before me, the papers and the delivery quite insightful, and definitely something to think about further. So my paper is entitled Minimum Wage as a Restitutive Measure. And because of time constraints, I'm just going to give us a basic outline of using minimum wage as a restitutive measure in the South African context, and this can be applied in other contexts as well, the basic principles associated there too. Okay, so the West has predominantly centered its economic modeling on capitalism. Individuals have the freedom to make decisions, and transactions take place within an open, competitive market environment. In the strive to gain the competitive advantage and within the context of competition, there's a drive for innovation, for progress, development, growth. And as a result thereof, we've seen numerous advances stretching to various spheres of our existence as a species. This graph just gives us just a short indication or illustration rather of some of the advances that we've seen from the 1990s. And I've just indicated 5 here. There are numerous other advances that we've seen that have been facilitated by capitalism together with globalization. And some of these are a reduction in child mortality rate worldwide reduction in the illiteracy, also reduced poverty worldwide. That's in terms of absolute levels. Also, world hunger, we've seen a reduction in hunger. And then perhaps rather surprisingly, one may say, there's also been a reduction in pollution from the 1990s, and that may be to a large extent be to a reduction in the use of fossil fuels and etc. So there's been numerous advancements on the back of globalization and capitalization, but there has also been problems associated with capitalism that one should not be blinded and just think there's just positives. And one of the predominant concern regarding capitalism is that we've seen an increase in the labor productivity since the year 2000, but also before that. I'll say from, let's say, from the 1970s, 1980s, it accelerated and it is still accelerating. And unfortunately, the increase in the labor productivity has not been aligned with correlating increase in terms of wages and in terms of real wages during the same period. So labor and workers have become more productive in terms of output, but the benefits thereof has not translated through in terms of wages, in other words, the earnings of workers in the real sense. Okay, so we see then, coupled with this, there's been a disproportional distribution of the earnings in the labor market or the incomes in the labor market, where you see a top sphere in the labor market that have increased their earnings in relation to the bottom sphere of the labor market that has seen no real growth in terms of wages or earnings, and even in some instances we've seen a regression of wages. And remember now, this coincides with an increase in labor productivity. So just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, in the last 20 years, the richest 1% in South Africa, their income has increased by 60% in the last 20 years. And that coincides with the regression of the earnings of the bottom sphere of the labor market. Okay, so just to give us a bit of context and something to pinpoint to, we can perhaps just quickly. Whilst we are talking about top earners in the labor market and their success and their elaboration of their wealth and earnings in the last few decades, we can perhaps just talk about executive remuneration in the South African context, just to make this practical. And recently we see that the Sanlam CEO in 2020 received a share-based remuneration package estimated to be between 160 to 500 million rand for the 2020 financial year. The Sibanye-Stillwater CEO, that's the mine, was paid a 90 million rand in 2021. That's in addition to a share-based remuneration package in the region of 250 million rand for the 2021 financial year. And then, rather disappointingly, one may say sarcastically, the MTN Group CEO earned an estimated package of 71 million for 2021. So just to put this in context, we can just it's necessary to refer to the tragedy, the Marikana tragedy, where 44 workers lost their lives. And one of a prominent request of these workers was that they requested increased wage. For example, rock drillers requested a wage of 10,500 rand per month, and it was considered absurd by the management of the mine, the Marikana mine. And it was considered absurd in the context where it was widely reported in the media that the mine CEO, the mine manager, received 1.2 million rand during the same period. So this remuneration, top executive remuneration, compensation in relation to the minimum wage, in relation to the wages of lower sphere workers, gives us a sense of the disproportionality that currently exists in the labor market in South Africa. So I should just also mention the excessive growth of top earners in the labor market is not just bound to South Africa. It's not just a national occurrence. It is a global phenomenon where globally we see excessive growth of wages of top earners, and that is in relation to the stagnating of lower sphere workers. But this situation is particularly problematic in the South African context. So is capitalism problem-free then? And the answer is definitely not. And a predominant problem with capitalism, associated with capitalism, is then inequality, and specifically excessive inequality. So I think it's important to make this clear that it becomes a definite problem when we are speaking about excessive inequality, and that may be excessively low inequality or excessively high inequality, such as the South African context. I can just mention there's a 2022 World Bank report that indicates that South Africa is currently the most unequal country in the world. So that indicates the current need for redress of our situation in South Africa. So what do I mean when I say excessively low inequality is a problem? Well, that is when there's a compression of wages in the labor market. In other words, there's not a lot of differentiation, if any, in the labor market. And we typically see that in the 1980s, in the socialist regimes, in the Czech Republic, in Russia in the 1980s, where there's not a lot of differentiation between wages. And the lack of differentiation then discourages any differentiation in terms of skills, training, development, in terms of working harder than my colleague, because you don't have an incentive or reward rather, for for any differentiation. It doesn't matter how hard I work, what I do, there's no differentiation or little differentiation, so I don't get the reward for differentiating myself from the other or my co-workers, etc. So it's important to note that low inequality is problematic, and typically the literature speaks about the effective inequality range, and that is typically the sweet spot of inequality that you typically want, where there's still room for people to differentiate themselves from others, to progress, to go up in the marketplace, to make themselves more employable, to get better salaries, etc., etc. So I just spoke about excessively low, the problem of excessively low inequality, but also, as I said, in the South African context of excessively high inequality, that's also problematic. And I think some of my colleagues mentioned this throughout the day, some of the perils associated with high inequality, excessively high inequality. And I just want to highlight a few aspects here. It's important to note that inequality is interrelated or very closely related to arguably South Africa's other two major problems besides inequality, and that is poverty and unemployment, as Prof. Thuli Madonsela lovely stated, that our unemployment rate, I think, is currently at around, for the second quarter, is around 33%. When you include workers that have given up looking for work, that percentage goes up by around about 11% to 43%, if I'm not mistaken. And then also, as Prof. Madonsela also pointed out, our poverty, there's around 55.5% of the population living in poverty. So these three aspects are arguably South Africa's main predominant problems, and it's important to note that they are interrelated, meaning that if you influence or affect one of them, chances are that you will affect the other two challenges as well. So what are some of the other challenges associated with high inequality? And I think I should just mention social unrest, crime, social problems such as domestic violence, gender-based violence, that is a major problem in South Africa. Substance abuse, also a major problem in South Africa. It also scares off investment, national, international investment that is so desperately needed in South Africa to facilitate economic growth. Also, the abuse and the abuse and the misuse of natural resources. We know we are a rich country in terms of resources, and it's unfortunate that these resources then are often abused and misused. Also, we see diminishments, the diminishing of advancement in human capital, growth and education. That is also a very significant aspect for the South African context, considering that the majority of our workers are low-skilled, low-trained workers that are in dire need of better education and development in terms of human capital. And then also you get populist political measures. There's also, we see that unfortunately, we see that often in the news. And also in terms of social cohesion, that's also a major problem in terms of excessive inequality then. So, how can minimum wage then be used as a restitutive measure to address inequality, and specifically now excessive inequality? And I think it's important to note that minimum wage is a statutorily determined measure directed at the lowest sphere of the labor market, where a minimum wage is determined, and you may not legally transgress that minimum. In other words, you may not legally pay lower than that minimum. In other words, you bring together, you narrow the disproportionality between the top sphere of the labor market and the lowest sphere of the labor market, therefore decreasing inequality. Now, you may say, but we are speaking about overall inequality, and wage differentiation is something different than overall inequality, but it's important to note that wage inequality is the foremost contributor to overall inequality. So, in other words, if you can use wages, you can use minimum wages to address overall inequality, because wages are wages in emerging countries. Wages are the predominant earnings of workers. So the minimum wage represents a statutory intervention directed at the lowest sphere of the labour market, and it is used as a restitutive measure to restore the economic position of labour, specifically bottom earners in the labour market that are generally not shared in the increases of productivity in an equitable manner. So just go back. So in other words, the minimum wage then is used to let the lowest tier of the labour market enjoy a more equitable share of the gains, the successes attributed to labour, which means that they are then they enjoy the success of their labour, so to speak, and they get a bigger share of the advancements, the productivity advancements, the innovation that has coincided with labour. So it is in this context, it is then used as a restorative measure to recover the position of labour, or make it more equitable at least. I can just say also, currently when we speak about minimum wage, and as I said, it's an intervention aimed at the bottom sphere of the labour market, there are also legislative measures directed at the top sphere of the labour market. Because remember now, if you're dealing with inequality and restitution, and there are two spheres of the labour market. So minimum wage focuses on the lowest sphere, but there are also measures directed at the top sphere of the labour market in the form of tax legislation, taxes that force or place a degree of restriction on top earners in the labour market in terms of what they can earn, what they are compensated for their labour. Another measure that we can also just speak about is the relatively recent introduction of the amendment of the Companies Act that has also made it executive remuneration and compensation more transparent, where these CEOs, these management of companies have to disclose their salaries, their earnings, and oftentimes in terms of the King Code, then also stakeholders such as shareholders have to vote to let these executives then get approval for those salaries. And then lastly, I can also just say the Companies Act also, the Companies Amendment Bill of 2021 also makes provision for so-called wage ratios, where companies have to express the ratio of the top earners and the lower earnings in terms of a ratio, and throughout the company there has to be a certain restriction in terms of the ratios, in terms of the difference of wages between workers in the hierarchy of the organization. So just to wrap up then, minimum wage as a restrictive measure can then address inequality, and by addressing inequality, by narrowing the disproportionality, we can also address poverty, because it is also useful to note that around 4.5 million workers in South Africa are considered as working poor. And I should also just mention, here, that the average wage earner has around 2.6 dependents. So you should not just be looking at the earner, but also his or hers the dependents then, and then also rather counterintuitively, one may say, unemployment may also be reduced as a result of the minimum wage. And there is literature evidence of this, where consumption fuel growth has driven growth and stimulation in the economy, leading to job creation, etc. So if I can just wrap up with a final slide, what are the risks associated with South African national minimum wage as a restitutive measure? So at the moment, and there's also a recent paper delivered by the University of Cape Town regarding this, is compliance is the reason for concern regarding compliance, and there's indication that compliance is quite low at this stage. So there's a problem, a possible problem there, and also inefficiencies in the Department of Labour in terms of enforcement and monitoring, sanctioning, etc. Of transgressions of the South African national minimum wage, and then also ineffective structuring of the South African national minimum wage may also be a problem in terms of the establishment of the national wage, the coverage, the ability, the elastability of such a structure or such a policy, and then also adjustment targets that should not be pursued at all costs, but should rather be elastic and be able to adjust to the conditions of the day. So that's it from my side. I welcome any questions, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Eric. Without further ado, we can now come to questions. For business
Sometimes in to reach you. Apologies.
Patrick, sorry, your sound is we can't hear you.
Thanks.
So Wendy, apologies. Go for it.
My name is Wendy Dobson. I am trying to share my slides with you. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with this very important conference some research that I have conducted as part of doctoral studies at the University of Pretoria Business School. So although my day job is at Standard Bank, what I'm presenting today, and I come to this as a sort of budding scholar practitioner, and my approach to the theme of this was to really think about the goal of social justice and restitution as tools of policy and law. And I think the previous speaker has really positioned a great example around the national minimum wage, and the national minimum wage as a piece of legislation that can be used to achieve restitution. But we have to be aware of the fact that the private sector, firms and their trade associations, play in shaping policy and law in every country, not just in South Africa. But if we look at key pieces of law that have attempted or attempt to bring about greater levels of social justice, we can see that the business community has been quite vocal in trying to influence those laws, and that would include the expropriation bill, the carbon tax, the sugar tax, the minimum wage, and so on. And this kind of lobbying happens in a number of ways. We have it very formally and overtly through NEDLAC, through submissions to Parliament that are public. But we also have more coercive ways through threats of investment strikes or threats of litigation. And if you sit in trade association meetings when regulatory reform is discussed, you will often hear representatives say this is unconstitutional, this is against the rule of law, in response to proposals that government put forward. Or we often see in the media that corporates threaten to withdraw investment, not proceed with new investment if changes are not made to the policy environment or to the legal environment. But there's also a great deal of informal and more covert lobbying that takes place through things like golf days, gala dinners to raise funds for political parties or candidates. The whole idea of having a quiet word with a public official or a parliamentarian. So lobbying happens, and it continues to happen. So I think it's important that we look at how do we make sure that the lobbying takes place, contributes to social justice and doesn't detract from it. And what's interesting in South Africa is that lobbying is not regulated or codified. There's no requirements to register as a lobbyist or to disclose in your annual report that you've been engaged in any lobbying. You don't have to disclose that you're a member of a particular business organization or trade association, or that you fund a think tank, and that think tank engaged in lobbying. There are no professional codes or standards for lobbying in South Africa, and there's very little evidence of voluntary self-regulation through corporate policies. A quick Google search will show that South African corporates don't publish their stance on lobbying and political action. And it's a major gap in the King Code of Corporate Governance, which is actually silent on this issue. Although this is a leader in many ways around ethical leadership, stakeholder engagement, the so-called triple bottom line, there are no requirements, for example, in the King Code to disclose the kind of engagements you have to influence policy and legislation in South Africa. And we should also be aware that multinationals engage in global lobbying strategies. We've seen scandals and whistleblowers related to what Uber has been doing around the world. And it's interesting that big democracies like India, Brazil, and South Africa don't regulate corporate political action. And also, corporate political action is not confined to national boundaries. More and more multinational corporations are shaping international policy and international legislation. The climate negotiations at COP are increasingly brought to you by private sector companies, corporations, sponsoring these events. They're not doing this out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing this to shape international legislation on climate change. But there are no global governance standards on responsible corporate political action. The United Nations Global Compact, which is probably the biggest codification of responsible business on the global stage, is also silent in respect to lobbying. So as someone who works in a bank and who has been responsible for a bank's lobbying and response to various policy and legislative changes since the global financial crisis, but also trying to be a responsible citizen of South Africa, and having previously worked at NEDLAC and in government, I started to have this internal dialogue about, well, what does it mean to do this responsibly? Can it be done responsibly in a way that's more morally permissible? And so I turned to various sets of literature. I turned to the scholarship on ethical lobbying. I looked at practitioner literature in other countries, and I saw that it had quite a lot of limitations when it came to applying this in South Africa. So it's assumed that you have a strong, pluralistic type of democracy where you're really having a competition of ideas, and you don't necessarily have the highly unequal structural inequalities in economic and then political power. We also assume, it assumes that Western ethical theories and philosophies are automatically relevant and applicable in an African context. This work has often produced very theoretically elegant codes of conduct which are not implementable. There's little insight into how actual people working in companies, working in trade associations, make ethical judgments and how they apply and think about these things in practice. And we also conflate what is the responsibility of the individual or the individual lobbyist versus the role of the company. And that's particularly problematic because we need to hold companies accountable, because corporate political action is, by definition, the act of a corporation rather than the act of an individual. And it always then gives rise to this idea that there are a few bad apples rather than a rotten barrel. So South Africa presented a really useful context in which to explore these questions, given our political economy, our history of government-business relations. The fact that in some ways corporate political action is actually required through NEDLAC, a range of other pieces of statute require companies, require government to consult companies before they finalize and implement various pieces of legislation. You know, for example, the NEDLAC Act requires government to consult business and labor before it takes labor legislation to Parliament, which means something like the national minimum wage is subject to lobbying by the business community. So I thought what might be useful is to actually engage with the people who do this on behalf of companies and see what they think about what actually constitutes responsible lobbying. And could we then develop some norms for this in South Africa that then could be used perhaps and codified into regulation or legislation? And I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of the research and the research methodology. Hopefully soon the actual thesis will be published, and I do have some papers on this that are available. But what was particularly interesting, and I didn't expect this myself, was that 87% of my participants actually had a shared understanding. Thought there would be a greater diversity of views from my own experience. And what was also interesting is the shared understanding of what responsible was based on this idea that there are trade-offs, and that these trade-offs should be managed in a way that in favor of the public good, and that companies should be willing to take short-term pain. They should be willing to accept a higher cost of compliance, for example, if this benefited the public, and that to do this, companies should actually have an explicit process for considering and managing and navigating these trade-offs, which I really found quite interesting. Now, there were some commonalities with what's in the sort of non-local practitioner literature. So the idea that you should have proper corporate governance around this behavior and conduct by firms. Companies should have policies around this, and those policies should be in the public domain. They should be transparent about what they're doing. It should be in their external annual reports. They should use specific types of strategies responsibly. They should be transparent about their trade associations, and they should be they should be constructive and build trust with government. But what was different about what South African practitioners thought really centered on this idea of identifying and navigating the trade-offs, and having principles in place for doing this, as well as processes in place for doing this. There was also a lot more skepticism about funding political parties, campaign finance in South Africa, which I think is understandable given that this has only recently become legislated and is something that's fairly new, and also some of the findings of the Zondo Commission and the hearings that were taking place as I was doing my research. It was also interesting that South African practitioners felt that you should use this kind of activity to build trust and partnerships with government, rather than using this as a way to try and hold government accountable in the public domain. So the concept, this idea, this thing called responsible corporate political action is actually not defined in the scholarship. So I hope to coin this term and to say that responsible corporate political action has integrity, and it has pro-social outcomes. And on the integrity side, it's about being honest, respectful, constructive, and transparent, and engaging in lobbying in a way that's consistent with your corporate values, but also your CSR commitments. And I think, climate change is a good example here, where many companies claim to have green credentials, but they're also involved in trade associations that are very vocal in terms of opposing the carbon tax. Pro-social outcomes include accepting that the cost of compliance is the cost of trust of business, and that short-term costs are necessary in terms of the public interest and in the long-term interest of the company, actually. That what we want to do is strengthen the regulatory framework and improve institutional efficacy. We don't want to do things that erode or weaken the regulatory framework. That balanced, fair regulation is actually in the interest of business, and that business has a responsibility to strengthen democracy, that firms benefit from functioning within a constitutional democracy, and therefore they have a responsibility and they need to find ways to strengthen democracy. So from my research, I've developed a code of practice for responsible CPA. I can share it with people who are interested in it. I'll put my email address in the chat box. But basically, so this definition I unpack in a lot of ways and say what should and what shouldn't be done. But let me end with some policy recommendations. I believe we shouldn't lose the opportunity post the Zondo Commission report to explicitly address the need to regulate corporate political action in South Africa. We can rely to some extent, not completely, on voluntary self-regulation. We should expect trade associations and business organizations like Business Leadership South Africa to actually adopt a code of conduct on how they do this. The integrity pledge that they released to great fanfare a few years ago did not go beyond what's already in existing legislation. And again, was silent about lobbying. I think we should expect our listed companies to publish policies on their stance on how they go about seeking to influence policy and legislation in South Africa. So I believe, for example, it should be in listing requirements of the JSE and in the non-financial reporting requirements. The JSE has just released new requirements related to sustainability. Again, it doesn't really talk very much about this aspect of corporate social responsibility. And I believe strongly it should be in the next iteration of the King Code of Corporate Governance. And finally, I really do believe ideally we should have legislation on this. It's not a panacea. We can see that in other jurisdictions, this is legislated, and we still have problematic conduct, but it's a start. And it would be useful to apply our minds and think about what regulation in this area could look like. So overall, what I'm really making the case for is that if we want to achieve, and we want to achieve social justice and restitution in South Africa, then we need to regulate corporate political action.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Thanks very much, Wendy. Now, I don't have a very good sense of where in Stellenbosch the timing is, and my hope is 15 minutes remains at least for us. Is that okay, Julie? You'd agree for another 15 minutes for Q&A?
According to the organizers, we have no time.
We're out, okay.
I think the report back session has already started.
Oh my, okay. I was told we were 40 minutes behind, but I suppose we're the ones that are victims. But I hope everyone's able to stay in touch with Eric and Wendy. Yeah, and of course, Julie. And look forward very much to seeing how it moves from here. Thank you to everyone who's come, and have a great final session. I'll see you there.
Rachel from Backside.
It's lovely to see Mary.
In fact, I brought something for you, but it's in my room. Our hands and helpers campaign.
It's wonderful. Love you with guys. Mama Mary, you've always been at the forefront of being great. This is mine.
I'm going to slip out to get back to Cape Town. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful day.
Oh, I just want to throw something away. Thank you. You're welcome. I'm sure if I should turn this thing off now, because it's still running.
Yeah, everything's captured.
It's still recording.
What is it?
Yeah.
Okay, everything can off.
So they all know watching you.
Okay.
Next.
Okay. Good job.